Welcome to the Access to Inspiration podcast, the podcast with a social mission to encourage you to reflect on the world differently and be inspired by people who may be unlike you. We always like to push our boundaries and experiment, so this month we have invited back some of our previous guests so that they can chat to someone who inspires them or they want to learn more about. So after you've listened to the episodes, do get in touch as we love getting your feedback. Tell us what impact has each episode had on you? How has the conversation caused you to have a different perspective on the world? And as always, you can get in touch with us via the website at accesstoinspiration.org, where you can also read a transcript of each episode. And we now have over 90 for you to choose from. Our guest host today is Rachel Wanjiku Kagame, who was a guest on episode 12 of the podcast. I'm really looking forward to the guest she's brought to the conversation today, who was originally her mentor, Dr. James Kisia. But we're going to find out all about that as we go. Rachel, welcome to the podcast, and you can introduce your guest.
Thank you so much for inviting me again. And this time round, it's a little bit different because you've allowed me to bring a guest with me. So I'm very privileged. When you sent the request to invite someone who I greatly admire and someone who I look up to, top on my list was Dr. James Kisia. And I don't know if you remember, we all met James in the last leadership class that Hugh facilitated for the organization I was working with. So Dr. Kisia walked to my desk and said, there's this leadership training we're organizing and you must attend. And I tried giving every excuse of how I had not budgeted for it, how my workload will not allow me. And he's like, no, Rachel, you must take this, is life-changing. And through this training that you did for us more than 10 years ago, it's where both you, Sue, and Dr. James Kisia and myself, I would say this is where the partnership with Sue began. So today I'm very excited to host one of my mentors, and it's none other than Dr. James Kisia. Dr. James, you're very welcome, and maybe you can just introduce yourself to our listeners today.
Thank you, Rachel. So my name is Dr. James Kisia. I'm a physician with public health training and management training and experience. In my earlier career, I used to be a clinician. I moved on to the NGO sector, where I quickly moved into senior management with one of the largest NGOs in Kenya. And thereafter, I went to work for a research organization. But before then, I had an opportunity to be the founding executive director for a research think tank. And today, I'm working as a country director for Catholic Medical Mission. So my career has moved from management, clinical, and at one point, I should have said that I also worked in the private sector. So the three pillars of our society, private sector, government, and NGO, or the non-owned world of social change. During this time, I've had a huge opportunity to interact with young people that have worked with me and for me. And I hope I have created a change that can have impact in their lives. And I've enjoyed it completely. I should say that I have mountain climbing. I've been on top of Mount Kilimanjaro. I've been on top of Mount Kenya. And I'm a budding environmentalist. I grow trees and I nurture trees and I relate very well with the environment, which I think is the most important existential threat to the planet and to ourselves and to our ways of life. And this is where I'm putting a lot of my effort today, also in leadership in environment.
Quite an impressive resume, Dr. Kisia. And interesting enough, you are a qualified medical doctor. How long did you get to practice as a doctor, and what motivated you to transition from being a physician and now to being a leader in the NGO sector?
So I practiced for almost 10 years, but I should say that when I was in medical school, I always talked about working for NGOs in difficult areas. One of the NGOs I wanted to work for was MSF. I was impressed with the fact that they're in South Sudan. They're in all these areas with conflict, impacting on a population that was very vulnerable, and also advocating for rights of people who had been impacted by natural and man-made disasters. One time when I was in practice, a colleague of mine, actually my best friend, Courage Ateka, a guy from Nigeria, who is now a physician in Atlanta, asked me, James, did you ever work for MSF? You always wanted to work for MSF. I said, oh, That's when I realized that I had actually put aside this dream, and I rekindled it, went back, moved from my clinical practice to work for Kenya Red Cross, and never looked back then. And that was something that I really wanted to do.
Interesting. And it's never too late. Who knows, maybe MSF will be the next door that would open. But I'm curious to find out, Dr. Kisia, looking at your years of experience, what you've managed to accomplish, I'm really curious about your childhood. Did it in any way impact your leadership? How were you brought up? And how did your childhood contribute to becoming this great leader?
Well, I think my childhood was a fairly normal one for a child growing up in Mombasa. Both my parents had been teachers. My father was a mathematics teacher in the 50s, and my mother was an English teacher. And what they imparted in all of us was the importance of education. But I think more importantly, in the process of that, what they imparted, it was levels of curiosity. We became very curious through books. Through books, you can travel anywhere you wanted. You could travel to medieval England. You could travel to America. You could travel to India and have intimate conversations with the authors. We could travel to the central province and listen to Ngugi wa Thiong'o talking about these places that we thought were far away, not to realize that they were part of our country. So I think that level of curiosity and encouragement to just explore. My dad was clear that you needed to explore and see what would come out of it. He encouraged experimenting. And I think this kind of thing did give us, myself and my siblings, some early start to exploring the world around us and seeing what is it that we can do, make a change.
It's fascinating as I'm listening to you talk about books and curiosity. I'm reminded of a previous guest we had on the podcast who was an astronaut. And he had a very similar experience in that his parents encouraged him and his brothers to bring the encyclopedia off the shelf when they had a question and to follow the curiosity and to learn about it. So it seems that it's a very important quality for any of us to have. I'm wondering how it shows up for you today in your work. How do you utilize your curiosity today?
Well, on several levels. If you tell me something, you just say something, I'm going to be curious about whether that statement should be taken on its face value or whether we should actually examine it. And I think what my father used to do very early is used to challenge us to debates. We make some sweeping statements and he says, well, that's okay. But then he would throw a word to challenge to make it actually the opposite of what you just said. And then you're forced to think. So I think the curiosity is also around exploring areas of physically, mentally, and even artistically, and areas of feeling, not just taking for granted that when I speak to young people, I am also curious as to how they're feeling, not just what they're saying. So the issue of listening to people in terms of their thought, observing what they do, and also being empathetic and taking in what it is that they feel and being curious about how they feel about certain things is important in my leadership style.
That's so fascinating. I'm also curious as to when Rachel was working with you, what was it that you saw in her that you were encouraging her to take this leadership course, for example, and to develop herself?
Yeah, so if you know, Kenya had post-election violence in 2007, 2008, and Rachel was hired straight from college to be one of the people working in a camp in Nakuru. And when I met Rachel, she was very articulate about what they were doing, and she was clear about what our role was. So for me, the one thing that is a major predictor of success for young people is curiosity and passion. These are very important things. And I think I should add also creativity. What I saw with Rachel is that she was able to solve problems. And within a short time, I encouraged the manager then to transfer her to a bigger camp where she would be even more challenged, because when people are not challenged, they usually will find challenge elsewhere. They move on to other organizations. But I saw someone who was passionate about what she was doing. I saw someone who had a curiosity quotient that was a bit higher than most staff that we had at that time. And from my experience, I think this person can go far. and they need the exposure. And I think one of the things that I have for me is developing people. So developing not just ideas, but developing people. And I derive great pleasure at seeing people just develop from college and being able to do what they were able to do, because I know that's the case for me. When I get skill and a competence that I can do my work and enjoy it because of a training or a motivation or something that I've gained, then work becomes fun. It becomes part of life. It's not separate from it.
Well, it's lovely to hear what you saw in Rachel all those years ago. And here we are today having this conversation, the three of us. Amazing. Rachel, what do you make of it? And what are you curious about discovering?
So indeed, Sue, I remember when I did my podcast session with you, I made reference to Dr. Kisia, who was very instrumental. And what I'm really, really grateful is the ability of a leader to see potential in people, because I was fresh from college and the task was gigantic. Like, we had over 300,000 people who were displaced. In school, they didn't teach us how to manage such displacements, but they taught us how to solve problems. So the fact that Dr. Kisia saw a young girl with potential and really gave me a more difficult challenge, it was bigger than me. I self-doubted myself, but really to just get the affirmation of a leader who's willing to show me the way and handhold me up to today is something I'm really grateful. What we find with most leaders, they really don't want to give power away. Some leaders are very insecure. They feel maybe if I mentor you, you will outdo me or you will outshine me. But there's enough light for everyone to shine and everyone to thrive in their niche. So, Dr. Kisia, for other people who could be in a similar situation as me, what would you tell aspiring leaders? Why is mentorship important, and what would make a mentorship journey value adding for both the mentor and mentee?
One of the things to do for Kenyans and for Africans is to know that there is a context within which we operate. And context is very important for leadership. The way in which we respond to the world is largely influenced by our own perception of the world. So we have had an education system that has remained competitive. And we must be aware of that default. Our education system is competitive. I mean, if you have young children, you have people who visit your house and they will ask your children, which class are you in? They'll say, I'm in standard 6. So which number did you come? What was your rank in this last term? And the boy says, number 2. Then they, wow, excellent. When they say number 30, it's, oh, wow. And it's just a straight line competition without having the empathy to understand that different people and different children learn differently. And sometimes it's the teachers who are not imparting or not responding to the children. Others have learning disability like dyslexia, and they can be branded. So this system of competition at school is often carried forth into the workplace. And the workplace does need collaboration. And it does need for you to collaborate and as a leader to bring all that you have and to impart skills, competencies, and soft skills to the people working with you so that they can be the best that they can be. And when they are the best that they can be, then that actually helps you as a leader. So I think the one thing we have to be aware of in our context is an unhealthy competition that has been fostered over time by exams, by competition in class. You find that sometimes you can have a leader who is competing against people who are reporting to him. But one of the things for leadership important for people to develop is to develop authenticity and to develop ability to manage themselves. Because authenticity and ability to manage yourselves gives you the security that this is who I am, these are my strengths, these are my weaknesses. It gives you that ability to actually be able to know other people are coming in to compliment you, and you can do so much as a human being. But the idea is that as long as you're authentic, people are going to be influenced by you. Once people realize the leader is not authentic, the leader will just make themselves great, then of course you lose the people. So it's important to keep in mind that the same thing that you aspire as a leader, others have similar aspirations, and to nurture them and to support them. The other thing that I wanted to say is questioning. Then it goes in the realm of creative thinking, and you're not going to be a leader without a lot of critical thinking and creative thinking, which questions the traditional organizational structure and the traditional way of doing things. so that you continue to experiment on what works and you continue to experiment on what works for your people. But you can only do that if you're questioning the knowledge that you found in order to create new knowledge. And leaders have a huge platform for doing that. So that's something that is lost when people just follow what they found there before.
Excellent. So the mentor is a person who knows the way, goes the way, and shows the way. Who would you say is one person who has impacted you in your leadership journey, and why?
I think there are several people impacted me, positive or negative, but impacted me nonetheless. One is my longtime boss, the CEO of Kenya Red Cross, Abbas Gulet. His form of leadership is not the same as mine, but he's definitely impacted my leadership by continuously challenging me in terms of education, in terms of doing, oftentimes throwing me in the deep end to learn to sink or swim. And that has a huge impact in my life. I've admired the leadership of people like Nelson Mandela and Wangari Maathai, who led in a very authentic way and were clear that their ideas were worth dying for. I've always admired those kind of leaders that are clarity of thought, clarity of action, and the ideals are very strong and very clear in their minds. I've also admired environmentalists and people like the late Chico Mendes in Brazil, who actually was killed for his activism in the Amazon rainforest. We now know that sooner or later it will be a net emitter of carbon because of the kind of ravages that it's undergoing. Industrialists, farmers, and including arsonists cut down the forest. So those are the people that I have admired. But I should say that I had a very early leader, my father, who has been a big influence in my life, always challenging me. My father wrote 2 books before he passed on this year. And he wrote the books when he was in his 80s. And he always asked me that, haven't you found something that you can write about? He did not quite look at journal articles as writing. So it was always challenging around new things. The issue about mentorship is you need a mentor who walks the talk, not just somebody who speaks, and a leader who allows you to question what they say, somebody that you admire their way of doing things, and someone who can also articulate, bring out tacit issues that you may have into explicit, where you can do something about, you can talk about, you can reflect on, and that kind of thing. And I think also it's issues around sense making. It's good to have a mentor who is good at making sense of things, because oftentimes we think that our reality is constructed in the darkness of a foreign language, electrochemicals in our brain, but we need to make sense of that. In the end, we need to make sense of that for us and for others to do something with.
As I'm listening to you speak, I'm imagining how Rachel must have seen those qualities within you as a mentor over the years. And I'd like to turn our attention to leadership in Africa and the NGO sector. Traditionally, as far as I've understood, NGOs have played a leading role in providing humanitarian and development aid in Africa. I'm wondering, from your perspective, is that still the same, or is the roles of NGOs evolving?
I think the roles are evolving, but in order to understand leadership in the NGO sector in Africa, it's indispensable that one has to think about the international aid architecture and the role the INGOs have had in Africa, good and bad. I think over the years, the international NGOs have played a disproportionately large part of international aid interventions than the local NGOs. Right now, we are in the middle of a serious conversation on localization of NGO work, which is a bit problematic. Just localization as a word is problematic because NGO work takes place in the local context. But I think over the years, the privileging of international over local has actually not had a very good effect on local NGO leadership development. And it's not past, it's a continuous thing. These conversations are taking place within the international aid sector. So there have been indigenous NGOs that have developed ways of developing people, but I think this is an area of huge growth because leadership is not just generic and it can't be the same everywhere. So in Africa, we have to find ways in which we develop people within the constraints that are there, within the constraints of finances. And I think one of the ways that we can do is mentorship. And it's a cheap way to do because leaders have to give of themselves already in place and they have to be collegial. I think what has happened is that over the years, you find that oftentimes leaders are not necessarily collegial, they're hierarchical. And one of the models of leadership that we have taken into the NGO sector, the government model of leadership, which is hierarchical, and bring that into the NGO sector, which is not necessarily what fits there because you are in a creative environment, you are doing projects, you need brainstorming, you need ideas, you need many stakeholders to be involved. So we have to develop this. The other countries have the luxury of you can go to Harvard Business School, you can go to London Business School and learn their perspective. Now, the perspective of leadership here is a low trust society, a society that has less education, a society that has a lot fewer leaders, and oftentimes bottlenecks that are placed in become a leader, artificial bottlenecks. And we have to tackle that in Africa. This is not something that we are even starting to scratch the surface.
There sounds like there's real opportunities for leadership development amongst leaders and would-be leaders in Africa. In terms of working in an NGO, do you think there are any unique challenges that you face? Same question to Rachel, because you're both country directors in organizations. What do you both of you think are the unique challenges and opportunities that you face?
I think the unique challenges are unreliable budgetary allocations or funding. Sometimes it could be even too much budget allocation, but it's not the unreliability of that. Sometimes it's feast or famine. You have too much money within a short time when disasters occur, and then once the disasters disappear, you don't have any money. And the problems persist. Slowly and slowly, the gap between the rich and the poor is increasing significantly. And in countries like Kenya, that is the case. And we are at this stage in our development where our investments as a country will continue to favor those who are educated and those who have some resources to invest. And the cost of living will go up. And as the people in the upper echelons and economic levels adjust, it becomes very difficult for the poor people. These are issues that are not going away and very frustrating when you are in the NGO sector because you are actually interacting with a very vulnerable population. And you can see that small changes in infrastructure where they live, small changes in service delivery can make a huge difference. Small changes in education provision and water and sanitation can make a huge, huge difference. So I think there are opportunities within the NGO sector. You have the opportunity to think through things and to make changes very quickly. So the ability to innovate is one of those big ones for me, and to see change and to advocate with local governments and with the health sector. For example, our NGO deals with an integrated rural health program in maternal and child health. And we can see that we can spend a little bit of money that will allow a well-intentioned policymaker and budget creator within the government to actually scale up that intervention if it's shown to work.
So it sounds like having stories to tell and communicating those to the source of funding may also then increase understanding. That's what I'm hearing from you.
Yeah.
Rachel, do you have a similar perspective?
So in addition to the funding that is unsustainable, that's a big challenge for all NGOs. I would say the biggest challenge we have across the divide is leadership. I believe strongly with good leadership, we can be able to resolve our problems by ourselves and with our own resources. If you look at Africa, it's really rich, it's well endowed with resources, it has brilliant minds. We have the solutions, we know the context and we have the solution. So I feel if maybe governments can be held more accountable, if governments can prioritize investments where it really matters, we can be able to resolve all this. And we can have a very bold plan to say in the next 10 years as Africa, we do not want to rely on external aid. It's not dignifying. But for you to be able to utilize what you already have optimally, then it calls for good leadership. So I really feel a lot of the challenges besides funding, it's the systemic challenges and the leadership challenges we have at governance level, at oversight level, at policy level. If you receive 100% of funding, you find that little can be shown to have an impact because a lot of it, we have high corruption rates. As Dr. Kisia mentioned, we are a low trust society. But all these narratives, it can be changed with good leadership.
Well, I'm pleased that I'm hearing from you both that African people can solve and address their own challenges, which maybe just takes us around to localisation in a little bit more detail. I know, Rachel, you had some questions on that.
Just following up on the funding that we've talked about, and we have the localization agenda that's really gaining momentum in Africa, but it really calls for we Africans being ready to be able to be entrusted with resources, with decision making and choices that really affect us. And Kisia, because we're in the same landscape, what opportunities and challenges do you foresee to accelerate the localization agenda?
Yeah, I think there's a confluence of things that have accelerated the localization agenda. We've been talking about localization for quite some time. I was in 2016 in the World Humanitarian Summit in Turkey, where we talked about it. But I think a few things that have brought this discussion to the fore. One has been COVID. 2 years that we had these lockdowns and restrictions on travel. It forced thinking about how we do our work within the NGO sector and the importance of local when you have to rely on the local. And I think it also started to point to the area that we called capacity, that we said oftentimes capacity did not exist within the local organization. We start to redefine capacity, including local knowledge, including the fact that presence itself and being within the area and being able to attend to issues right away without a huge cost is itself capacity. Because previously we had looked at accounting capacity, capacity to articulate issues, and now we were forced to privilege local over international because societies were starting to close down and you had to address things from where you are. So that's one. I think the other one is also the movement Black Lives Matter was an important step in examining the manner in which internationals and also the role of governments in policy and the interconnectedness of issues all over the world. I think the other one that was an important one was the Me Too movement, and where the large NGOs lost a lot of funding because of some behavior, sexual harassment of women and misuse of funds. So I think these kinds of confluence of things have put light into issues around localization. Just to make it clear, only 6% of the funding within the NGO sector was going to local organizations, and that's disproportionately very low. USAID has said that they will move that to 25 and they will move that to 50. And that means that there's an opportunity for local NGOs to develop themselves, not just operational capacity, but also the leadership capacity, because you do need the leadership capacity to support the agenda. I think the other thing is that you have seen this move into serious discussions within the academic sphere, because they're talking about localization and decolonization. These two things seem to run very similar because of the background of the big NGOs. So you have seen this move to universities, you've seen this move to areas of research, and they are going to impact on all of us. They're going to move us towards more localization.
And for the current organization you're working with, Dr. Kisia, maybe you can just tell us a little bit more about what you do and what you enjoy the most in your current role.
The organization I work for is CMMB, and CMMB is a 110-year-old organization that was started in Haiti by Dr. Flagg, an anesthetist whose child died at birth. And he was reflective about things and wanted to make sure that other parents did not experience the same. So he started the organization as a result of a bad experience. And oftentimes, a deep reflection out of adversity. And he was able to create this organization that has been functioning now for 110 years. And we largely deal with maternal and child health in an integrated manner, serving those communities that are most vulnerable, communities that are rural or communities that are peri-urban or informal settlements within the cities in Africa, in Haiti, in the Caribbean, and in Peru. Here in Kenya, we work with largely rural communities that do not have access to healthcare. And where women lose their lives giving birth, and where children and infants lose their lives just because there isn't the facility or there isn't the knowledge to make sure that they are delivered in a health facility. We are trying to create some breakthrough innovations, some life-changing services for those most vulnerable. And what I like about it is that I'm able to interact with people that just almost like forgotten, want to say that, and advocate on their behalf to the government and to say that they deserve dignity in their lives and dignity in health. And that is a measure of how we ourselves are as human beings, how we treat most vulnerable. So I think that for me is core of why I continue to serve in this organization and the organizations that I served in the past. I think every time I moved away from this kind of core mission for me at community health and serving the most vulnerable, I don't do very well. So the issue around leadership is that you must find something that you're passionate about. When I went into research, I found myself quite miserable and far removed from the impact that I wanted to create. When I moved into knowledge management, I also found myself a bit, and I quickly moved back into development work.
Dr. Kisia, a leader is a reader. Which book are you currently reading?
I'm reading a book called Change, and it's on change management. John Carter, I think he's a retired Harvard professor.
Okay, excellent.
Rachel, what book are you reading?
So I'm reading Attitude 101 by John C. Maxwell. Dr. Kisia, what legacy would you like to be remembered for?
I think one never knows what their legacy is, especially as long as they are still alive. But I think the point is that for me, the one thing that I enjoy most is developing young people and finding talent and finding ways in which they can unfold their true potential. I have experimented with organizational cultures and try to create that space that people can manage themselves. It's managing people. It's an anomaly. I think sometimes less is more. And the idea would be for people who work with me to know that I try to create space, safe space for them to do their work and manage themselves and then guide them through that. So I think that for me would be an important one. I think something I've taken up in the last 10 years is the environment. And I grow trees. A lot of them have grown 3,000 trees in the last 3 years. And I don't feel I've done enough, trying to get my son to do more of that, trying to get my wife to do the same. So I think environment is big for me and doing what we can. I'm always reminded of Wangari Maathai, who said that there was a fire, a small bird kept picking up water with its beak and dropping it to the fire. And another big animal said, look, what do you think that's going to do? It's just a drop. And the small bird said, well, that's what I can do. I'm doing my part. And I think for me is if I do my part and leave somebody feeling that it was useful for me to be in their lives and it was useful for me to be in the environment, then I think that's good enough for me.
As you were talking there, I was thinking what we've heard today in this conversation is evident that ripple effect. Small drops, small steps can lead to great things. And the small steps of encouragement, of drawing out Rachel's belief in her own potential, led her eventually to this conversation and her then introducing you back into it, Dr. Kisia. It's been a fantastic opportunity to hear from you. If our listeners do want to find out more about yourself and the work that you do, is there a website that they can go to?
CMMB.org. We have a LinkedIn page and I'm also on LinkedIn.
Fantastic. Well, we'll put links to those things onto the show notes. And of course, Rachel, we shall signpost listeners to your earlier episode. Thank you both for your time. I don't know if you have any closing words as well, Rachel.
It's been an absolute delight to host and interview my mentor, who I really greatly admire, and you, Sue, also for being a coach all these years. And I'm a product of what's possible when mentorship is done right and growing leaders. So thank you both, Dr. Kisia and Sue, for that opportunity. Appreciated.
Fantastic. So there's been so much rich information shared today. I'm sure our listeners will love this episode. Thank you both for your time.
Thank you, Sue. Bye-bye.
Thanks to Rachel and James for such a stimulating conversation. Next week, we have two filmmakers in conversation. Pierre Haustein will be talking to Brendan Davis about the documentary film he made about the Atuel River in Argentina. I hope you can join us then.